The San Ysidro McDonald's massacre occurred on July 18, 1984, in San Ysidro, California, when 41-year-old James Huberty opened fire inside a McDonald's restaurant. Over 77 minutes, he killed 21 people and wounded 19 others, including children. The attack ended when a SWAT sniper fatally shot Huberty from a nearby rooftop. The massacre led to changes in police response tactics and remains one of the deadliest mass shootings in U.S. history. James Oliver Huberty was born on October 11, 1942, in Canton, Ohio. He was the second child of Earl and Eichel Huberty, a deeply religious couple who were devoted members of the Methodist Church. His father worked as a quality inspector, while his mother took care of the home. At just 3 years old, Huberty was diagnosed with polio, a disease that forced him to wear steel and leather leg braces. Although he eventually regained his ability to walk, the illness left him with a permanent limp, something that would follow him for the rest of his life. In 1950, his father made the decision to move the family to a large 155-acre farm in Mount Eaton, Ohio. But Eichel had no interest in rural life. She not only refused to move, but abandoned her family altogether, choosing instead to become a Pentecostal street preacher in Tucson, Arizona. The loss of his mother hit James hard. His father later recalled a moment where he found the boy collapsed in tears by the family's chicken coop, struggling to cope with the reality that she was never coming back. Socially, Huberty was withdrawn and spent most of his time alone. He had little interest in making friends, instead dedicating himself to target practice. Even as a child, he showed a fascination with firearms, spending hours refining his aim. A family acquaintance later described him as a strange and isolated boy, constantly honing his skills with a pistol. By the time he reached his teenage years, he had also developed a strong interest in modifying and repairing guns. His quiet nature, combined with his limp and his family's extreme religious beliefs, made him an easy target for bullying at Waynedale High School. He also wasn't a particularly strong student, finishing in the lower half of his graduating class in 1960. After high school, James briefly attended Malone College, initially studying sociology. However, he eventually changed course and enrolled at the Pittsburgh Institute of Mortuary Science. In 1964, he completed his training with honors, earning his credentials as a funeral director. The following year, he obtained his license as an embalmer. In early 1965, James Huberty married Etna Markland, a woman he had met during his time at Malone College. Not long after the marriage, he found work at a funeral home in Canton. While he was skilled in embalming, his quiet and withdrawn nature made it difficult for him to interact with grieving families. This occasionally led to friction with his employers, but he remained in the field for 2 years before deciding it wasn't the right fit. Seeking a career change, he took a welding job at a company in Louisville, where he worked for another 2 years before landing a higher-paying position at Babcock & Wilcox in June 1969. Despite being reserved and keeping to himself, Huberty was seen as a dependable employee. He often took on extra hours, steadily moved up the ranks, and by the mid-1970s was making between $25,000 and $30,000 per year, equivalent to roughly $142,000 to $170,000 today. With his growing income, Huberty and Etna moved into a large 3-story house in an upscale neighborhood in Massacre, Ohio. However, in the winter of 1971, their home was completely destroyed in a fire. The couple wasted no time rebuilding, purchasing another house on the same street. Later, they took advantage of the land where their first home once stood, constructing a 6-unit apartment complex that they managed themselves. By the early 1970s, the Hubertys had started a family. Their first daughter, Zelia, was born in 1972, followed by their second, Cassandra, in 1974. James Huberty had a long history of domestic violence, frequently lashing out at his wife and daughters. His outbursts ranged from slapping and punching his children to holding knives to their throats. At one point, his wife reported to the Canton Department of Children and Family Services that he had injured her jaw. However, she later downplayed the extent of the abuse, claiming that, despite multiple incidents, he had only struck her hard once. Starting in 1976, Aetna repeatedly urged Huberty to seek professional help to manage his stress and paranoia, but he refused to consider therapy. Instead, she devised her own way of keeping his temper in check. Over time, she convinced him that she had the ability to predict the future using playing and tarot cards. Huberty put full faith in her readings, and for brief periods, they seemed to calm him. He often followed her advice based on these readings, giving Aetna some control over his actions. Huberty was also deeply paranoid and convinced that global catastrophe was on the horizon. A staunch conspiracy theorist and self-proclaimed survivalist, he believed the Cold War was spiraling toward disaster. First under President Jimmy Carter, then Ronald Reagan, he became convinced that the U.S. government was actively working against him. Certain that economic collapse or nuclear war was imminent, he dedicated himself to preparing for doomsday. His home was stocked with large quantities of non-perishable food and an arsenal of weapons, some of which he purchased from co-workers. In November 1982, James Huberty lost his welding job at Babcock & Wilcox, a blow that sent him into a deep depression. Struggling with financial hardship and feeling powerless to support his family, he became increasingly despondent. A former co-worker later recalled Huberty making a chilling remark when the company announced its closure. If he couldn't provide for his family, he would take his own life and take everyone with him. His wife noticed disturbing changes in his behavior not long after he became unemployed. He started hearing voices, and in early 1983, he reached a breaking point. One day, he pressed a loaded pistol to his temple, threatening to end his life, before being talked out of it by his wife. Unable to find stable work in Ohio, the Hubertys decided to sell their 6-unit apartment building for $115,000. Huberty briefly found welding work at Union Metal Manufacturing Company, but the job lasted only 5 weeks before the plant shut down. Adding to his misfortune, he and one of his daughters were involved in a car accident shortly after. The crash worsened the chronic neck pain he had suffered since childhood and triggered occasional tremors in his hands and arms, which only fueled his frustration. By summer, the Hubertys applied for residency in Mexico, convinced they could stretch their money further there. In September, they sold their home for $12,000 in cash, with the buyer taking over their $48,000 mortgage. When the family made the move in October 1983, they left most of their belongings behind in storage. But Huberty made sure to bring his extensive collection of firearms, ammunition, and survival supplies. His wife and daughters adjusted well, quickly forming friendships with their new neighbors. James, on the other hand, struggled. He barely spoke Spanish and remained withdrawn, growing increasingly frustrated as he failed to find employment. Within 3 months, he regretted relocating. By early 1984, the family abandoned their plans in Mexico and moved to San Ysidro, a struggling district of San Diego, just north of the U.S.-Mexico border. The area had a population of 13,000 at the time and offered little in terms of opportunity, but Huberty was out of options. In San Ysidro, the Hubertys settled into an apartment at the Cottonwood Apartments, while James Huberty looked for work. As the only Anglo-American family in the complex, they stood out, and Huberty's frustration with the situation grew. He became increasingly rude and distant toward his neighbors, unable to find peace in his new environment. Soon, Huberty responded to a newspaper ad offering federally funded security guard training. He completed the course on April 12th and quickly found a job with a security firm in Chula Vista, where he was tasked with guarding a condominium complex. The wages from this position allowed the Hubertys to have their belongings shipped from Ohio. By the end of April, they moved into a 2-bedroom apartment on Averill Road, paying $450 in monthly rent. However, Huberty's stint as a security guard would be short-lived. On July 10th, he was dismissed from his job. His employers cited his poor work performance and physical instability as the primary reasons for the termination. On July 15th, 1984, James Huberty acknowledged to his wife that he suspected he was struggling with a mental health issue. 2 days later, he contacted a mental health clinic in San Diego, leaving his details with the receptionist and requesting an appointment. He was assured the clinic would return his call within hours. Huberty waited anxiously by the phone for a call back. However, after several hours of waiting, he suddenly left the house without explanation, riding off on his motorcycle to an unknown location. It wasn't until later that Huberty discovered the receptionist had misspelled his name as Schuberty, leading to a delay. The operator had recorded the call as a non-crisis situation, as Huberty had stated he'd never been hospitalized for mental health problems. Because of this, the inquiry was classified as something to be addressed within 48 hours. An hour later, Huberty returned home in a surprisingly upbeat mood. After having dinner with his family, they all rode their bikes to a nearby park. Later that evening, he and Etna watched a movie together at home, seemingly unaware of the chaos that was about to unfold. On the morning of Wednesday, July 18th, 1984, the Huberty family spent the day at the San Diego Zoo. As they walked through the zoo, Huberty confided in Etna, telling her that he felt his life was essentially over. In reference to the mental health clinic's failure to return his phone call from the previous day, he stated, quote, "Well, society had their chance." After a lunch at a McDonald's in the Claremont area of San Diego, the family returned home. Shortly after arriving, Huberty went into his bedroom, dressed in a maroon t-shirt and green camouflage pants, while his wife lay resting on the bed. He approached Etna and, with a strange calmness, said, "I want to kiss you goodbye." After their kiss, Etna asked where he was going, as she intended to prepare dinner for the family. Huberty simply responded, "I'm going hunting. Hunting for humans." With a gun slung over his shoulder, a box of ammunition in hand, and a bundle wrapped in a checkered blanket, Huberty looked at his older daughter, Zelia, before heading toward the front door. He calmly said, "Goodbye. I won't be back." Huberty then drove down San Ysidro Boulevard, initially heading toward a Big Bear supermarket, followed by a visit to a post office. He eventually parked in the lot of a McDonald's restaurant, roughly 200 yards from the family's apartment on Averill Road. He carried a 9mm Browning HP semi-automatic pistol, a 9mm Uzi carbine, a Winchester 1200 12-gauge pump-action shotgun, and a box, along with a cloth bag, containing hundreds of rounds of ammunition for each firearm. At the time, 45 customers were inside the restaurant. Minutes after entering the restaurant, Huberty aimed his shotgun at 16-year-old employee John Arnold from about 15 feet away. When Huberty pulled the trigger, nothing happened. As he examined the weapon, restaurant manager Neva Kane walked toward the service counter near Arnold. Mistakenly believing the situation was some kind of joke, Arnold started to walk away. At that moment, Huberty fired his shotgun into the ceiling before turning his Uzi on Kane, fatally shooting her beneath the left eye. Immediately after, Huberty shot Arnold in the chest and arm, then shouted for everybody to get on the ground. He insulted the people inside, calling them racial slurs, and claiming that he'd killed thousands in Vietnam and intended to kill thousands more. As the customers and staff processed the horror, 25-year-old Victor Rivera attempted to talk Huberty down. In response, Huberty shot him 14 times, yelling "Shut up" as Rivera cried out in agony. As terrified customers and employees took cover beneath tables and booths, Huberty focused on 6 women and children huddled together. He first shot and killed 19-year-old Maria Colmenero Silva with a single round to the chest, then turned his Uzi on 9-year-old Claudia Perez, shooting her multiple times in the stomach. Perez's 15-year-old sister Imelda was wounded in the hand. He then fired his shotgun at 11-year-old Aurora Peña, hitting her in the leg. Peña's pregnant aunt, 18-year-old Jackie Reyes, had attempted to shield her niece. Huberty shot Reyes 48 times with the Uzi. Beside his mother's body, 8-month-old Carlos Reyes sat up and cried. Huberty then yelled at the infant before executing him with a single pistol shot to the back. Next, Huberty shot and killed 62-year-old trucker Lawrence Versluis before turning his attention to a family near the play area. 31-year-old Blythe Reagan Herrera had hidden her 11-year-old son, Matao, beneath a booth, while her husband Ronald shielded their son's friend, 12-year-old Keith Thomas, under a booth across from them. Ronald urged Thomas to stay still as he covered the boy with his body. Thomas was then shot multiple times, but survived. Ronald Herrera suffered 6 gunshot wounds, but also managed to live. However, Blythe and Matao were both killed by multiple shots to the head. Nearby, 3 women attempted to take cover beneath a booth. 24-year-old Guadalupe del Rio laid against a wall, shielded by her friends, 25-year-old Gloria Ramirez, and 31-year-old Aristelci Vuelvas Vargas. Del Rio was struck multiple times, but survived with non-life-threatening injuries. Ramirez was unharmed, while Vargas suffered a gunshot wound to the back of the head. She succumbed to her injuries the following day, making her the only victim who reached the hospital alive, but did not survive. At another booth, Huberty shot and killed 45-year-old banker Hugo Velázquez Vázquez with a single bullet to the chest. The first 911 call was placed shortly after 4 p.m., reporting a child who had been shot and taken to a nearby post office. However, the dispatcher mistakenly directed officers to a different McDonald's, located 2 miles away, causing a delay in lockdown procedures. The only immediate warnings to nearby civilians came from passers-by. Around the same time, a young woman named Lydia Flores drove into the parking lot. As she pulled up to the food pickup window, she noticed shattered glass and the sound of gunfire. Looking up, she saw Huberty shooting. Panicked, she reversed her car until she crashed into a fence. Grabbing her 2-year-old daughter, Melissa, she fled and hid in nearby bushes until the massacre ended. At approximately 4:05 p.m., Astolfo and Maricela Felix drove toward one of the restaurant's service areas. Seeing the broken windows, Astolfo initially assumed construction work was underway. He believed Huberty, now walking toward their car, was a worker. Suddenly, Huberty opened fire with his shotgun and Uzi, striking Maricela in the face, arms, and chest, blinding her in one eye and permanently disabling one of her hands. Their 4-month-old daughter, Carlita, was critically wounded in the neck, chest, and abdomen. Astolfo himself was shot in the chest and head. Miraculously, all 3 members of the Felix family survived. Moments later, 3 11-year-old boys rode their BMX bikes into the west parking lot. Hearing an onlooker yell something from across the street, they hesitated. It was too late. Huberty fired his shotgun and Uzi, striking all 3. Joshua Coleman collapsed, critically wounded in the back arm and leg. He later recalled glancing toward his 2 friends, Omar Alonso Hernandez and David Flores Delgado. Hernandez lay on the ground, with multiple gunshot wounds to his back, vomiting, while Delgado had been shot several times in the head. Coleman survived, but both Hernandez and Delgado died at the scene. Huberty then turned his attention to an elderly couple, 74-year-old Miguel Victoria Ulloa and his 69-year-old wife, Aida Velázquez Victoria, as they approached the entrance. As Miguel reached to open the door for Aida, Huberty fired, killing her instantly with a shot to the face and wounding Miguel. A surviving witness, Oscar Mondragon, later recounted how Miguel cradled his wife's lifeless body, wiping the blood from her face while cursing at Huberty. Unmoved, Huberty walked up to the grieving man, shouted an expletive at him, and executed him with a shot to the head. About 10 minutes after the first 911 call, police arrived at the correct McDonald's. Officer Miguel Rosario was the first on the scene, quickly assessing the situation and relaying the details to the San Diego Police Department as Huberty fired at his patrol car. Responding officers immediately locked down a 6-block radius around the restaurant. A command post was set up 2 blocks away, with 175 officers positioned strategically. Within an hour, several SWAT team members arrived, taking up positions around the building. With Huberty rapidly firing and switching between weapons, police were initially unsure how many shooters were inside. The shattered restaurant windows made it even harder to see clearly, as reflections from the broken glass distorted their view. At first, authorities feared there might be hostages. However, a survivor who had escaped confirmed there was only one gunman, shooting at anyone he saw. By 5:05 p.m., officers were given authorization to kill Huberty on site. Several survivors later recalled seeing Huberty walk to the counter and adjust a portable radio, seemingly searching for news coverage of the massacre. Instead, he tuned into a music station and continued shooting, dancing as he fired. Shortly after, he entered the kitchen, where 6 employees were hiding. One of the female employees screamed in Spanish, "Don't kill me." But Huberty opened fire, killing 21-year-old Paulina Lopez, 19-year-old Elsa Borboa Fierro, and 18-year-old Margarita Padilla. 17-year-old Albert Leos was critically wounded. Just before the shooting started, Padilla had grabbed the hand of her friend, 17-year-old Wendy Flanagan, and the two tried to run. Padilla was shot and killed, while Flanagan managed to escape. She, along with 4 other employees, a female customer, and her infant, hid inside a basement utility room. A wounded Leos later crawled his way to the same hiding place after being shot 5 times. When a fire truck entered the area, Huberty opened fire, riddling the vehicle with bullets and slightly injuring one of the occupants. Moments later, he heard 19-year-old Jose Perez moaning in pain. Huberty walked up and shot him in the head, killing him. Perez died alongside his friend and neighbor, 22-year-old Gloria Gonzalez, and another young woman, Michelle Carncross. Nearby, Aurora Peña, who had been lying wounded among the bodies of her aunt, baby cousin, and 2 friends, noticed a brief pause in the shooting. Opening her eyes, she saw Huberty standing over her, staring. He cursed, threw a bag of fries at her, then retrieved his shotgun and shot her in the arm, neck, and jaw. Peña survived, but endured the longest hospital stay of any survivor. At 5:17 p.m., Huberty moved from the service counter toward the doorway near the drive-through window, giving 27-year-old SWAT sniper Charles Foster, positioned on the roof of a post office across the street, a clear shot. Foster fired a single round from about 35 yards away. The bullet struck Huberty in the chest, severing his aorta just below the heart and exiting through his spine. The impact sent Huberty sprawling backward in front of the service counter, killing him almost instantly. After taking the shot, Foster radioed that the suspect was down, but kept his focus on the motionless body. Given the sheer number of gunshots fired inside the restaurant, officers were still unsure if Huberty was the only shooter. About a minute later, a police sergeant entered the building, confirming there was only one shooter. The entire rampage had lasted 77 minutes. Huberty had fired at least 257 rounds, killing 20 people and wounding many others. Only 10 people inside escaped uninjured. The ages of the victims ranged from 4 months to 74 years, most of them of Mexican or Mexican-American descent, reflecting the local community. Throughout the attack, Huberty shouted accusations and insults at his victims. At one point, he yelled that he didn't deserve to live, but that he was taking care of this matter himself. Despite repeatedly claiming to be a Vietnam War veteran, he had never served in any branch of the military. Initial reports from the San Diego Police Department suggested that all victims had been shot in the first few minutes of the attack. However, survivors strongly disputed this, stating that Huberty had continued shooting both wounded and unwounded victims for over 40 minutes after he first opened fire. In the wake of the massacre, McDonald's suspended all television and radio advertisements, with rival chain Burger King following suit in solidarity. Huberty's body was cremated on July 23, 1984, with no formal religious service. His ashes were later interred in Ohio. His wife and daughters faced numerous death threats, forcing them to temporarily stay with a family friend and attend counseling for over 9 months. Initially relocating to Chula Vista under assumed names, they later moved to Spring Valley in San Diego County. Due to the sheer number of victims, local funeral homes had to use the San Ysidro Civic Center for wakes, while Mount Carmel Church held back-to-back funeral masses to accommodate all the burials. The tragedy led the San Diego Police Department to reassess its tactical response and upgrade its firearms and special unit training. 2 days after the massacre, McDonald's had fully refurbished the restaurant, intending to reopen it. However, after discussions with community leaders, the decision was made to permanently close the location. McDonald's donated $1 million to a survivors fund, with an additional $100,000 contributed personally by Joan Kroc, widow of McDonald's founder Ray Kroc, to assist with burial costs, financial aid, and counseling for survivors. In 1990, a permanent memorial was unveiled at 460 West San Ysidro Boulevard, featuring 21 hexagonal white marble pillars, each inscribed with a victim's name. Every year, on the anniversary of the massacre, the memorial is adorned with flowers, and during Dia de los Muertos, candles and offerings are left in remembrance of the lives lost.